time and like watch shows.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks so much for coming. Science on Tap, spring edition. Okay, so my name is Susan Knight. I work at UW Trout Lake Station. And Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, the idea conceived in 1905 that the borders of the university are the borders of the state. And our partners in Science on Tap include the Minocqua Public Library, the Lakeland chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, UW Kemp Natural Resources Station, UW Trout Lake Station, WXPR, our wonderful public radio station, and of course our hosts here at Oakfire Pizzeria and Bar. Science on Tap, yep, thanks to everybody. Science on Tap is supported through a grant from the Brittingham Fund to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And don't forget, there are 3 ways you can watch. You can come here for the real event, which is always the best. But you can also watch live on YouTube. And we also archive all of our presentations so you can watch later on. So, and our next speaker, next month in May, when maybe we won't have 3 feet of snow out the window, will be Bernadette Gillick of UW-Madison, and she'll be discussing neuroplasticity, the amazing changing brain across the lifespan. That should be pretty interesting. But tonight we have Lydia Margano. Lydia was born on an Air Force base in Bitburg, Germany, but she grew up in the Piedmont of South Carolina. For her junior and senior years in high school, she attended the South Carolina Governor's School for Science and Mathematics, where she was immersed in biology and ornithology courses that really struck her and got her interest in wildlife. She graduated from Clemson University with degrees in biological sciences and wildlife and fisheries biology. She then jumped straight into grad school at West Virginia University, studying king and clapper rails in intracoastal Virginia waterways using autonomous recording units. So maybe she'll tell us more about that. She continued her education at the University of Georgia, working on the South Florida Deer Project, where she combined telemetry and trail camera data to monitor the population dynamics of white-tailed deer within the Florida Panther Range. Since finishing her PhD in May 2021, she's been with the Wisconsin DNR Office of Applied Science team. She's now the Wildlife Population Dynamics and Modeling Research Scientist. Her new role involves evaluating and improving how we monitor Wisconsin's wildlife populations, from fur bearers to ungulates to carnivores. And here is your trivia question for Lydia. While working one summer in Virginia, she and her colleague lived in field housing, which was really just a garage with a bathroom. One day, when she got back from adventuring in the salt marshes, she walked into the bathroom and discovered an unwanted guest. She closed the door and told her colleague, "The bathroom's occupied." Who was the uninvited guest? A boa constrictor fresh from the Everglades. B, a very large snapping turtle. Or C, a family of skunks. Snapping turtle. All right, here's Lydia.
Well, thank you, Susan, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for coming today. I will say this is my first Science on Tap, even though I actually live 5 minutes down the road now. So I hope to come out to more in the future, but just had a little one, so if I'm a little awkward, it's because they don't get out much anymore. So, like Susan said, I work with the Office of Applied Sciences, and I'm the new, as of 20, or I guess less than a year ago, the wildlife populations research scientist. And so I get to be a nice hodgepodge, jack of all trades kind of person. I deal with not only fur bearers, I deal with elk. Actually, yesterday I was dealing with elk. Earlier this week I was dealing with deer. And so I get the fun joy of experience all of our species, but also the hard part of dealing with all of our species. And so it can be a kind of a whirlwind adventure, but we're going to kind of focus in on otters today and river otters. And as some of you might have known if you came to the last event, the original speaker was going to be Sean Rossler, and he's my counterpart in wildlife management. So the way the Office of Applied Sciences works, we are just a sort of a division within the Fish and Wildlife Parks kind of program. And so we work in conjunction with wildlife management, and we provide them with the most up-to-date and sound science and decision support tools to help them better inform management decisions that they make. And so kind of that's the overview of what I do, and we're going to kind of jump right into river otters and, you know, their utterly adorableness. And so to give you an overview of where we're going, we're going to start with a little history of river otters and where they are. I'll touch on how we manage them and pretty much what our research is and what I do in the Office of Applied Science with regards to river otters. And then we'll open it up to our questions. So river otters, historically, were found throughout the riverways of the entire North America, United States, and Canada. And they were pretty much dominant throughout. However, following European colonization, there was this period of over-exploitation. So all of the European settlers came in, found these awesome river otters. River otters are known for kind of renowned for their beautiful coats that are quite warm. And the reason that these coats are so warm is they're using these waterway systems, but they're warm-blooded creatures. So they need this kind of really dense coat to keep warm while, you know, being submerged in almost freezing temperatures out here. So they were overexploited, pretty much hunted to a point that by 1970, so not that far ago, the river otter range that was once Canada all the way to the United States contracted to the point that only 75%, 75% of it contracted, so there was only 25% of the entire population left in the U.S. and Canada. But thankfully, following some protective legislation, so and think about the 1970s, we're starting to get the CITES, which is the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered and Threatened Species. So CITES comes in and it says that we're going to start creating this convention where different countries throughout the entire world, so right now there's about 187 countries that have agreed to this convention that we are going to protect and kind of manage the way that we start trading. With regards to river otters, this is important because river otter fur, as I mentioned, is very much a delicacy of for mink and kind of making those coats. So a lot of our river otter furs get sent overseas. Predominantly Russia is a great location because it's very cold, but even Canada, a lot of our furs from river otters get sent up to make these gorgeous coats, keep you warm during the winter. So CITES comes along and says we're going to create some more stricter protocols to monitor what's happening. Also in the 1970s, you're getting other kind of protective legislation, such as the Clean Water Act. So now we're going to start cleaning up our river systems. We're going to make these river systems, cleaner. We're going to make sure we're not going to be polluting them. So having some restoration in our riverways, also restoration of our wetlands. We're also, throughout the United States, doing some reintroduction of our river otter population. So some of these southern states get some reintroduction there, and we're kind of boosting the population there. And so with all this kind of protection, we have now rebounded, and we can safely say that river otters are found throughout all 49 states in the continental United States and Canada. So river otters have successfully rebounded. Yep, exactly. And a great thing about these populations, so throughout the United States and Canada, their populations are either stable or increasing. So we, as humans, have created the kind of headway to protect these species moving forward. So that's kind of a little bit of history of where river otters are. And in Wisconsin, we're doing great. River otters are on the up and up. So how do we go about managing the species? Now we saved it from extinction and extirpation, not necessarily extinction, but extirpation. We saved it. So how are we going to stop from doing that moving forward? So the way in which we manage river otters in Wisconsin is through doing supportive trapping. So we do allow trapping of our river otters, and it's just a way to kind of monitor the population and kind of keep the population in a safe, both ecological carrying capacity, but also social carrying capacity. River otters can damage property, and so we want to make sure that there's a balance between human and wildlife conflict. And so one thing that we have to kind of get a handle on river otters is that we do require that you tag your river otter. And river otters are, we only allow you to authorizedly take 2 river otters every year, if you get an opportunity. So that's if you get an opportunity to get a river otter. But once you harvest a river otter, we have, again, I mentioned CITES, so that's that international trade. So you register your river otter, and immediately we send you this tag that says, this is a specific river otter, it was harvested here, and we are part of that CITES convention, and kind of make sure that we are keeping track of where every single river otter pelt is going. So that's kind of a cool way in which we inform that. So that's kind of just a brief overview of what we do from a management side. But now to get really fun and nerdy, I'm going to talk about what I do with the research side. And so there's really sort of 4 or 5 ways in which we conduct research on river otters. The first kind of research component that I look into is that harvest registration. So the main component and way we monitor these species is through harvest. And so anytime somebody harvests an animal, we require them to, put sort of the county in which they harvested. We require information on what's the sex. And all of this information comes together, and I can kind of start to build a picture. And it's just one component to go into this picture of, okay, what's our sex distribution? Or do we have a healthy sex distribution? We oftentimes want to make sure we have a large female population that's constantly producing these young juvenile kits back into the population. So I'm using this, one component, again, is that harvest. Another component, which it ties in a little bit to harvest, is every 3 years, I send out or ask a subsample of all of our trappers to, if they harvest an individual, I ask them to send in a jawbone of their river otter. And with this jawbone, I take one tooth, so I take the canine, and I submit it to Matson's laboratory, which is a laboratory that takes this tooth that we send them and cuts it in half, and it allows them to begin to age this individual, so age their otter. So it's very much like a tree, where if you cut the tree in half, you can count the rings. Similar to a tooth, you can cut it in half and you can count how old an individual is. So not only do we get, again, harvest, we get sex, now we're getting age, so now we're building these pieces together. Another interesting way in which we get information about our population is surveys. So we send out tons, well, I wouldn't say tons, we send out numerous surveys and different types of surveys throughout the state every year. So one of the surveys we send out is a fur trapper survey. So we send out to our trappers a general survey asking them, okay, what species did you trap? How many of these individuals trapped? How much effort did it take to trap these species? So that's some information that I'm using again to build into the population and kind of get a good pulse on what's happening. Another thing that we're interested in is the fur buyers. We want to ask them, okay, if you got an otter, how much did you price it at? How many are you getting? How many are you getting if you're buying these furs are from Wisconsin or from outside. And this gives us an index on the popularity of that species. You know, if the price of an otter pelt's going up, maybe this is going to drive our trappers to trap more in the future. You know, there is kind of a sort of a little bit of supply-demand there with trapper interest with regards to otters. And so that's sort of a third component that we're looking at. So harvest registration, tooth extractions, we have surveys, another component moving forward, and that we've just instituted, this is now year 2, is a river otter bridge survey. So this is a new survey that Wildlife Management has put in place, and so throughout the entire state of Wisconsin, in each county, we ask that there's either 1 or 2 bridges in which Wildlife Management staff goes out to, and we ask them to go out to this bridge 4 times during the winter, preferably after some snowfall. And at this bridge, that is across, you know, a bridge, there's a river that usually goes under it, and they walk this bridge and look at 4 sides and to see if there's any sign of a river otter. So they're looking for scat, they're looking for tracks, they're looking for these beautiful otter slides, and that's kind of telling us where otters are throughout the state. Again, this is a statewide survey, and so just a sign of an otter is a good indication, you know, that the otter is there in that county. So this has given us that beautiful statewide index moving forward. And then the last kind of component that I use to build this idea of what is our population doing is Snapshot Wisconsin. And hopefully we might have some people here that participate in Snapshot Wisconsin, but it's our trail camera system. There's over 15,000 cameras throughout the state, and this is a great opportunity to get at both spatial and temporal, so looking at space, so the entire state of Wisconsin, but also through time, temporally, where our otters are on the landscape. And so with all that information, I kind of feed it all together and start to make a picture of what our otter population is looking like. And so, like I mentioned, our otter population is doing great. We can actually find otters throughout every county in Wisconsin, so that's a plus. We have a really solid age distribution, no indication that that is changing. And from our harvest information, we have a beautiful sex distribution. We do know that some juveniles are taken, but predominantly it's adults, so there's pretty much steady, and that's a great indication of a healthy population throughout the state. Trying to think, and now, I mean, that's sort of kind of the gist of the research going into. You guys might have some more direct questions, but I think it's time to provide you guys with some fun otter facts, because really that's why you guys came, is the otter facts. So one really interesting thing about otters is that they use latrines. So yes, otters use latrines. So what does that mean? Well, in an entire specific area, an otter will choose a group of otters will choose a specific location in which that becomes the latrine. So think of it as that's the dog park that we go to, and that's where we're going to use the restroom. And it's actually very important. So it's not just a place where they use the restroom. That's the place where they say, hey, this is who all is in the area. So it is important from a scent point. And the fact that, so otters are considered a mustelid, so they have musk scent glands, and so they use it and kind of spray the area, and that kind of lets them know, like, maybe Jim is over here in the area that I'm also using. So it's a social interaction that they have. But yeah, it's also a great way that they keep their water clean. You don't want to be swimming in filthy water. Another fun otter fact is that, so in Wisconsin, we have the river otter. But in California and along the coast, there's the sea otter. Very, very much different. So oftentimes when you see footage or you see sort of a movie, it's actually a depiction of the sea otter, where they're looking all cute, they're holding hands. I have to break it to you guys. Otters do not hold hands. I'm sorry. I know I just broke some hearts. They do not hold hands. That is a misnomer. It was a very much opportunistic picture that that individual took in order to not float away, as that's what they say. You know, otters hold hands, they don't float away. But the sea otter actually just wraps itself in kelp. So seaweed that grows up, they wrap themselves in kelp, and that prevents them from floating away. But, you know, it's still true that you'll see a little baby pup on top of a mom otter. And the fun fact of that is that it does take the pup, at least because they're so buoyant, and the fact that they're so buoyant is they have really large lungs to create, to allow them to swim underwater for quite some time. So the pup has such a large lung that they're too buoyant to actually go under the water. So the mom has to kind of hold on to them for a while, maybe probably around 2 months before they are able to actually dive down. And so the more comparison is that our river otter is around 15 to 30 pounds. A sea otter can get up to 100 pounds. Yes, so very much different. Another fun fact is that our river otter, the tail of a river otter is about 40% of its body. So if you think about it, almost half. Another sea otter, it's about 25%. And the sea otter's tail is going to be flat because they need a more flat tail to swim throughout the water because they're pretty much staying in the water the entire time. Our river otters are more semi-aquatic. That means they tend to be in the water, but they're actually on land. They can traverse the land, especially during dispersal movement. So when males are leaving their mom to go find another river system. Yeah, those are some otter fun facts. Yeah, I'm not sure what else you guys are interested in, but I'd open up to Q&A. I'm going to try to keep it to fur bearers. And so if you have any other fur bearer, not necessarily otter questions, I'm more than welcome to.
We're going to use the mic so the people online can hear you.
Oh, hello, wonderful people online. This is awesome. Although you did ruin my whole otter survival swimming idea of like life, you know, like
Yeah.
you know, like we all work together. We hold on, like otters. Tell me more about the trapping, like you know, and also what's that versus the beaver? You know, because I you know, I work with lakeshore people and lakeshore property, and the beavers come in. I love them, but they do damage.
Yes.
and but they're wonderful, right? Because they build houses, right? Like what other animals build?
Exactly.
Ants, beavers. I don't know. Take it away.
Yeah, so trapping, I touched on it as a management, but that's a great question. So we do have trapping not only for the public, so for our hunters and trappers, but we also do, as you mentioned, they can be very damaging. So we do contract out to the wildlife services to, if you have an otter problem in a lake, they can come out and help trap them out. From a recreational trapping standpoint, you're more than welcome to set out a trap line after you have your trapper's license. I will stress that. And everyone who has a trapper's license, we no longer require a lottery system to get an otter tag. It's transitioned to the fact that since we have such an abundant population, everyone with a trapper's license now gets 2 otter authorizations. So you have the opportunity to take 2 otter now. And so that's an excellent opportunity, and it also shows that our population is doing great. With regards to beaver, as you mentioned, nuisance species, again, we contract out to wildlife services. They are able to handle it. But one thing that I didn't mention is that when wildlife services are out trapping for potentially beaver, there are some incidental bycatch. The traps that you use in a beaver setting, you can trap otter, and we keep track of all of that information. So we do, and that is included in our sort of overall harvest information, is the amount of incidental trapping caused from beaver for otter.
Okay, so they don't hold hands, oh darn. And that's okay with me, actually, that they don't. But what I would like to know is what their family structure or social structure is like.
Yeah, Yeah, that's an excellent question. So oftentimes if you do see a group of otters, it tends to be a mom with her young at that time, or it will maybe potentially be a group of bachelors. So these are going to be the young of the year group of boy otters that are like getting ready to like go off on their own, but they're not ready yet. They gotta like work each other up before they go off on their own. But from a family standpoint, it's usually, like I said, mom with babies, or the bachelors. There's not a mom-dad situation of raising the young. Mom's on her own, solo mom out there doing things on her own. That's kind of what we get from an otter standpoint. But these bachelor groups are definitely very interesting, especially because they tend to be the more ferocious. And so that's the thing, too, to think about is that, yes, otters are super cute, but they are a carnivore species, and they have the teeth of a carnivore. So they have really sharp canines. They do feed on fish, frogs, crayfish, potentially can take birds. And in an instance, if you get an otter in a trap, especially a live trap, it will be quite ferocious and try to go after, try to defend itself. So don't let the fact that it's cute and cuddly and, a favorite animal of yours detract you from the fact that it's can be deadly. Yeah.
All right. The last couple of decades, the hydrology has gotten much more dynamic.
Yep.
What kind of observations have been made about otter distribution and ranges and stuff because our wetlands, rivers, and stuff are being more dynamic than they have in the past?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So one thing to consider is that because the species is statewide, it's really hard to get very good census information. We no longer really try to do specific point counts of the otter population, so we're not going out and saying anymore that there's 50,000 otters, because we don't have that certainty anymore. It's too difficult to potentially monitor the entire population. So what we do instead is we create population indices to get at how many otter are on the landscape that reflect back to the population health. And so with regards to hydrology, we haven't had a project yet linking otter and hydrology, but we do have some beaver trout work that's looking at changes in temperature with regards to beaver dams. Really, otters are pretty resilient, and because they're semi-aquatic, they do have the opportunity to travel quite far to get into a new river system. And so, they can travel if it's a poor river system to get into a new location, but they're scattered throughout the entire state. So I don't quote me on this, but I don't think hydrology currently with the shifts is hindering the population, but it definitely could be of concern. And one thing that we're considering with our bridge otter surveys is we are looking at components of the water system that we're surveying. So how much ice is on the water, how much snow, the type of river system that the bridge is over, to indicate whether otters are specifically choosing different waterways over others.
Lydia, a question directly behind you.
Do any Wisconsin predators impact river otter numbers? How do they interact versus the impact of trapping?
Good question. So the predominant mortality of a river otter is human trappers and human dynamics from that standpoint. However, it's not out of the question that a predator, if a predator is given an opportunity, can take a river otter, such as a wolf, if given an opportunity, would. But one thing to consider is that, an otter is a carnivore, so it tends to be more at the top of the food chain. So predation's not necessarily going to be the end-all, be-all for a river otter. So when I say, trapping is important, it is predominantly the way in which we can go about managing and keeping these populations in check. And so want to kind of give a shout out to all of our trappers out there for helping to manage the species at a sustainable level. Oh.
Is there a good way to dissuade otters from using your dock as their latrine?
That is an excellent question, and unfortunately, I'm probably not the person to address that. I can get back to you. Probably Sean Rossler will have better tips and tricks to dissuade an otter from thinking that your dock's a good place to eat some fish and some clams.
I have heard that otter will hunt or feed for recreation, one of the few animals that would do so. Is that true or is that a fallacy?
So that's a very tough question to answer because it's really dependent on the individual. Such as humans have unique personalities, so do otters. And so some otters might just eat, hunt and eat for fun, but predominantly they're not just leaving it on the landscape. There tends to be a reason in which they are depredating a specific area. But like I said, otters are unique, and each individual has a different behavior.
At what age do otters begin to reproduce? What's the gestation period, and generally how many puppies do they have?
Excellent question. So otters start reproducing at age 2. And a unique thing about otters is they tend to mate in the spring, but they have something called a late gestation. So they'll mate, but not actually start the pregnancy until the winter period. So if I know I just had a baby, if I could have just timed it right, I could have, I got pregnant when I wanted and then waited and, waited to the right time. That would have been great. But from a standpoint of like how many young, they can have anywhere from 1 to 6 young, but usually 2 to 4. I know, 6 would be crazy, right? How often do otters reproduce? It can be yearly, but again, it depends on, they tend to have a pretty solid pregnancy rate, but I won't say it's every year. And younger otters tend to breed a little bit better than obviously, your older otters necessarily. They start to the nesting. Question in the back.
Back behind the post, right up to my mouth. We were just wondering, what exactly is the bad that they're doing in the landscape, the depredation of the lakeshore or whatever? What is the damage that they are doing that people are worried about?
So when I mention damaged, it's kind of more like your lakefront damaged property. If you have a lake in which you like to fish and you stock your lake, otters will get into your lake and eat all your fish. And so they will find a honey hole and they will stay in that honey hole until you remove them from it. But yeah, that's a main component, is the fact that recreational fishing, DDNR often stocks a lot of the lakes up here with fish, and an otter will get in and just completely wipe it out. But they don't tend to, there's not a whole lot of, I won't say there's tons of issues with damage along the embankment, so otters do create a den on an embankment, and another thing is if they don't find a den on an embankment, they can also use a beaver dam, and we'll use some beaver structures in which to den in. So that's another interesting fact. So there's a good play on beaver and otter, as we mentioned, because of that nuisance.
I spent quite a bit of time on Palmer Lake one year in the 90s in the wintertime, and I would see otter holes in one place, and it might be 300 yards to another hole near the shore. It's a dark water lake, so how far can they swim underwater in the wintertime, and how do they find an air hole that could be 300 yards away? Thanks.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I'm not necessarily sure about the amount of time that they can spend under, but a cool thing when otters do dive is that they close both their ears and their eyes when they're diving under. And that keeps the temperature and keeps the water flowing off them, keeping that aerodynamic. And a cool fact that I didn't mention, the difference between otters and sea otters is otters require, because they have a sort of longer tail and are not a sea dwelling, they're kind of just semi-aquatic, they do a complete undulation of their body. A sea otter does sort of short, static swims through. I mean, they have a kind of a flatter tail, more similar to like a beaver flat tail versus an otter, which has that round tail. But I'm not 100% sure about how exactly they are finding these air pockets. Probably they can sense temperature differences a little bit, as you would imagine, where fresh temperature coming in. But I can get back to you on that.
How do they spend a winter like this?
I mean, how do I spend a winter like this? Coming from the South, I'm questioning whether Wisconsin was a good decision. Yeah, so they have their dens along the riverbanks. They are awake the entire period. There is no hibernation. Otters stay awake. They're moving. This is how we're doing those otter winter surveys, track slides. So they are looking for sort of pockets of river systems that have some free flowing. So we'll get, a period of, warm temperature. Find those pockets of warm water. Yeah. So the question was, do we have a sense or a pulse on the amount of otters in Oneida or Vilas County? And so, unfortunately, the answer is no. We don't, because otter are managed on a statewide basis. And one thing we're kind of moving towards with the DNR is we're shifting away from stressing a specific number of an animal with regards to management. Management is shifting more towards, well, what is the population goal? Is the population goal to maintain? Is the population goal to increase? Is the population goal to decrease? And with those kind of maintain, increase, decrease, we're able to use more population indices and indexes, and we are able to incorporate more information to get a sense on, okay, if, say, for instance, our sex distribution is changing. If it's staying the same, that means we're probably, we're doing great, the population's pretty stable. But if we're seeing a drastic shift happening, that means something with regard to our management is occurring that's causing that shift, and we need to figure out what's happening. So I can't give you a specific number. We know it's a healthy population. We do know the number of otters being trapped in Oneida and Vilas County. We do know that there are otter present from our river bridge surveys. And we do have the trapper surveys too. So we're bringing all that information to say that the population's pretty healthy.
Question back here. You had mentioned that you can tell the age of the otter based on their teeth and kind of like a tree, the different rounds. Wondering, is that transferable to all animals or is that specific to otters?
That is an excellent question. So, teeth. I spend a lot of time with teeth these days. So not only do we age otter teeth, so otter teeth are aged. Every 3 years I take a sample of otter teeth and age them. Fun fact, last year the oldest otter was 8 years old. But I also every year take a sample of bobcats, and we age bobcats. Every year I age fisher, and I say I age, I send them off to get aged. I don't know how to age teeth. But also every year we do every single bear tooth that gets sent. We age every bear and we report that back to the hunters. And so we're able to keep track of ages that way too.
Cool. Thank you.
All right, this is me. Well, it'll be the last thing I say. I'm a Wisconsin alum, BS 95, MA 97, MA 2001. PhD 2011, and you're doing great. I love Wisconsin. You guys all ask the best questions. I mean, aren't we giving a shit about the world? Anyway, so how does STEM and stuff, like how are we getting, it's sort of a semi-political question, because, the election just happened yesterday. Like, are we getting women involved in our biology? Just asking.
Here we are. I mean, just saying.
Yeah.
Well, how do you feel? Like, how many people are you outnumbered?
Raise your hand if you're a woman biologist. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
I will point out I have 2 of my colleagues who are women here also. And so in the Office of Applied Science, it is predominantly women in our FTE positions currently. But you mentioned STEM, and I will say that one thing that we have, I mentioned it briefly, is Snapshot Wisconsin, and it's that trail camera system that we have throughout the state. And so we use it not only for monitoring our species, but there are also lesson plans that go along with all of our snapshot data, in which ranging from kindergarten all the way to high school, that teachers throughout the state can have access to and do different lessons with the children and get children more interested in STEM and wildlife throughout Wisconsin.
Thank you.
We have an online question, which you may have touched on already. We can occasionally see otter slides in the snow, but how do they get into the water through the ice?
So they're looking for pockets to get into the waterway from their snow. And so, yeah, like I mentioned, it's when we do our otter bridge surveys, we're really hoping it's a day or two after some of that fresh snow, so we're getting fresh slides or fresh tracks to be able to monitor the species. Unfortunately, that's not always the case, except this year, apparently, when there's always snow. But yeah, they're looking just for those pockets of not frozen over ice to get into. Ooh.
So you've mentioned the snow a couple times, and the otters are in the water and awake all the time, but what about some of the other fur bearers that might be trying to roll out right now with the deep snow, or even the deer? Do you expect implications from the depth and lateness of our snowpack this year?
Ooh, we have our first winter severity index question. That's very timely. So I actually, because I work with every species, I get to know all of the information. And so we just did an updated calculation of our March winter severity index, and we are looking at probably one of the pretty close. 2013 was probably the highest winter severity index. Previously, this is topping up there. A lot of our northern counties for March, every single day had over 18 inches of snow. So there was a lot of snow, a lot of points to add up to get these high winter severity index. And so thinking about that from a biological standpoint, fur bearers, they are still having to traverse across this landscape. So a lot of snowpack, but another thing is that crust of being able to walk on top. So a lot of snow with a nice crust makes it actually a lot easier for some of these animals to walk across. They don't weigh too heavy, and so they're not post-holing as you or I would as we walk through. So bobcats are still able to traverse. Foxes are doing fine. When we think about traveling, that's the standpoint, but we want to also think about the upcoming spring. Well, how much of the snow is impacting nutrition during the winter? So from a carnivore standpoint, it doesn't necessarily impact them as much, except for changing and shifting where their prey are on the landscape. And when the prey shifts, so do the predators. The predators are going to follow where the animals are. Deer are going to start using less, forested areas and trying to move towards trails because they're easier to walk on. I live down the road, and I swear I've seen 10 deer just walk on the road. And so because they're shifting their patterns, they're potentially making it easier for predators to hone in on these travel or wildlife corridors, and so it can make it easier for a predator to ambush and be able to take them. So it's not unheard of bobcats being able to ambush deer and take down deer. From my experience down in South Florida, we often have like 6-point bucks that get taken down by a bobcat. So yeah, just because it's a smaller carnivore doesn't mean it's not as impactful.
Yeah, aside from the fact that the river environment is their birthright, what positive contributions do otters make to their ecosystem?
Yeah, so one excellent contribution is that, they're, participating in sort of the ecosystem food chain, and they are helping to keep a lot of the smaller vertebrae kind of in check in these systems. So if you're thinking about a lot of the mussels and clams, fish, even nuisance fish, oftentimes, otters are excellent at kind of managing from that standpoint and keeping those populations in check. There's, I think that's sort of a huge component. They also do other ecosystem services. Otters are a great indicator of a waterway's health. If you have an otter present, it probably means the water in itself is very healthy and I wouldn't say drinkable, but like it's a healthy ecosystem. So we can oftentimes use an otter as an indicator species that if it's present, then the system is doing well.
It sounds like the otters are doing pretty well in the system. What animals around here do you feel less, or you're more concerned about?
Excellent question. From a fur bear standpoint, one thing that is starting to be brought to our attention is gray fox. From these fur trapper surveys, one of the questions we ask is, from your perception as a trapper, how do you feel that the population has changed since last year? And better yet, another question is, how has the population of all of these species changed from 10 years ago since you were up here? And so one thing we're noticing is that our trappers are having a perception that the population of gray fox is changing, and it seems like they're feeling like it's decreasing. And so not only do we rely on science, but we're also taking input from the public. So if the public is perceiving a population change, then it's our job to provide that information to help inform whether that change is actually occurring or just provide more information to the public. So will most likely be digging more into gray fox. Another species that is constantly of concern is our American marten population, which is found in the more northern counties of Wisconsin, and it's an endangered species. So it doesn't necessarily fall into the wildlife management component because it's not a wild game species, but it is an endangered species which falls into a different division. But it's a species that we're constantly of interest.
We have another online question. How many otters are trapped yearly in Oneida and Vilas counties?
Oh, okay. I can't pull that off the top of my head, but I can get back to that person. I do have that information, but I can't speak to a number because I'm in charge of the entire state's numbers, and so
Only in the 70s this last year for both counties, like 69 and 71.
The online person who asked?
Yeah, that's all that was taken in this last year. Right around 70 in both counties this last year. As long as I've got this, do you see the state going to just a quota otter system where we would just fill out a quota? It doesn't matter if you got 9 and I got none, something like that. I mean, we've seen the liberalization with that 2 tag.
So the question obviously was whether Otter is going to be shifting to quotas. I am the OAS representative on the Fur Taker Advisory Committee, so I'm part of the committee that helps guide suggestions that are taken to the NRB. And from that kind of discussion, from what I've seen, there's probably not a shift towards an open quota. One thing that we have to keep track of is CITES and making sure that each otter tag also gets an associated CITES tag. And one thing in which that happens is that every otter pelt has to be checked by a game warden.
Well, they don't anymore, we just have to
Yeah,
call.
we just have to call,
But
but.
I mean, you could go to a quota, you get your 2 otters without even setting an otter trap.
Yeah,
If you do any trapping, any water trapping, you're full, you got your 2 otters, and it turns you into a poacher to get hold of somebody else that's got 2 more tags, or I'm turning them into the local warden. And 9 other trappers don't trap them at all. It's too bad they not utilize them. It would just open it up. There's no, none of us are out there anymore. There's no trappers, and that's why there's
Yeah.
67 otters, and I know of 30 of them. For those
Yeah.
counties, there's just nobody doing it. It's too bad it's not opened up. And we're not gonna say, gotta get all those otters.
Yeah.
But you're done before you start.
no, I completely agree. But I will say that one thing that we've talked about in the committee is the use of, specifically for otters, is shifting away from quota to harvest goal. So there is no longer a strict quota, but we do have a harvest goal that is set every year. And when the harvest goal is getting close, as people start registering, there is a number at which the committee can reconvene and decide to close the season.
You keep mentioning that CITES tag, I don't think anybody has any idea.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Just show them that tag,
Yeah.
so they see what you mean. So we have to have those on there to send them to a fur buyer.
I have a question about the fish eating. We have a cabin on a lake. It's a seepage lake, about 600 acres. And it seems like over the decades, we see otters on the lake maybe every 10 years or so, very sporadically, but they do usually have that latrine area on a flat, uninhabited area. But and the last time we saw them was during the rusty crayfish infestation about 12 years ago. But here's what I'm wondering, because from the fishery people on our Lake Owners Association, as they track the data over the years, they're looking, every now and then I keep hearing from them that they're saying, we just don't know what happened this year. There were fewer such and such of some species. So my question is it possible for a family of otters to move into a lake, make an impact on the fishery, on a lake that size, make an impact on the fishery, then leave, and so the next year, when they take the census for the walleyes and the perch, the fish aren't there? Thanks.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so my initial reaction to that is that if it's a viable lake, there's probably not a huge drive for them to relocate. So they'll probably be present, even if that fish that they're interested in gets depleted, they will still use other species. Okay, so they're completely gone, and yeah.
They're gone, and then we're wondering where all the fish went.
Mm-hmm.
Not many people know about the otters.
Exactly, yeah. And I mean, they will continue to disperse, but yeah, also need to think, if it's an entire group of otters, they'll probably still hang around. And it might even be that that specific otter got trapped out instead of them relocating. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, they're always gone the next year.
Mm-hmm.
And then everybody's wondering where the fish went.
Yeah.
That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, no, they can definitely like wipe out. I wouldn't say wipe out a fish population, but they can definitely like hit it hard. They also eat frogs, and that's kind of cool.
Any other questions in the audience tonight or comments? All right.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody, for coming. Thanks and especially for your questions, and thanks to our sponsors, Trout Lake, Kemp Natural Resources Station, the Library, Oak Fire, WXPR, and the Alumni Group. Thank you very much, and thanks especially to the Brittingham Fund. Remember, our next speaker will be Bernadette Gillick of UW-Madison discussing neuroplasticity, the amazing changing brain across the lifespan, next month, May 4th, 2023. And if you want to sign up to get an email alert, we have a sign-up sheet in the back, or you can go to our website and click on Contact Us and sign up right there. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to Lydia.